The plane had just reached cruising altitude. The cabin was quiet. In first class, everything was perfect. White leather seats, soft jazz playing, champagne glasses clinking. But not everyone was calm. Morgan Freeman, 86, was seated by the window. He wore a soft gray sweater, reading glasses low on his nose. He quietly asked for a blanket. Just a blanket. The young flight attendant rolled her eyes. Her name tag read Jessica. She had already made up her mind about him. "Sir, we're busy right now. Can you wait?" she said sharply. Morgan gave a kind smile and nodded. Of course. But then he coughed. A dry, tired cough. Jessica spun around. "I said wait!" she snapped. Then, out of nowhere, she slapped him, across the face, right there. A hush fell over the cabin. Morgan slowly touched his cheek. He didn't speak. His eyes filled with water, not from pain, but from something much deeper. And then came her final blow. "You old men think you own the sky." Oh, if only she knew. The man she just struck, his wife, owned the very sky she thought she ruled. Jessica strutted down the aisle like nothing had happened. Some passengers stared, others whispered, but no one said a word. Morgan Freeman sat still, looking out the window. The mark on his cheek began to fade, but the wound inside, it grew deeper. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He just whispered to himself, "What have we become?" Jessica had no idea who he was. She didn't recognize his face, his voice, or the wisdom in his eyes. She didn't know this was the man who once played God, who narrated history, who gave hope to generations. All she saw was a tired old man. But the pilot knew. The co-pilot knew. The head of staff knew. They had been told before takeoff that a very important passenger was aboard. Special protocol. Discretion. Respect. But Jessica, she wasn't listening that day. And now, she had crossed a line she could never return from. As the plane glided over the clouds, something shifted. One steward whispered to another, "Do you know who that is?" Jessica laughed from the back. Just another needy old man. But the truth was about to land harder than any turbulence she'd ever faced. Minutes passed. Morgan hadn't moved. His hands were folded. His eyes were closed. Then, softly, like a prayer, he spoke. "I have lived 86 years on this earth, and I've never been struck without cause. Not once." His voice was quiet, yet it filled the entire cabin. People stopped what they were doing. Even the pilot turned to listen. Jessica rolled her eyes again. "Oh, please, are you giving a speech now?" Morgan didn't answer her. He looked at the other passengers. One by one. Elderly couples. A young mother with her child. Businessmen in suits, all frozen. "Kindness," he said, "costs nothing. But cruelty. Cruelty always comes with a price." And then, without anger, without force, he said the words that would make Jessica's heart stop. "Call Margaret." The cabin manager froze. "You mean Mrs. Freeman?" "Yes," he said. "My wife." Jessica laughed, still clueless. "What's she gonna do? Write me a letter?" The cabin manager leaned in, whispering in her ear. Jessica's face went pale. "Wait, what? His wife owns the plane?" The mood turned cold. Jessica finally understood. She hadn't slapped a man. She had slapped the sky itself. Jessica stood frozen. Her face was pale now. The smile? Gone. The cabin manager stepped back and looked at Morgan Freeman. "Sir, would you like to speak to her now?" Morgan didn't answer. He just kept staring out the window. The other flight attendants quietly moved to the side. One whispered, "Do you know who his wife is?" Jessica snapped, "Oh, stop it! Who cares?" The pilot's voice suddenly came through the intercom. "This is your captain. We'd like to personally welcome Mr. Morgan Freeman aboard." There was a pause. "And we also welcome Mrs. Margaret Freeman, CEO of Freeman Skies." Jessica's lips parted, but no sound came out. Everyone turned and stared at her. Morgan finally turned to face her. "You judged me before you knew me," he said softly. "You didn't see an old man. You saw someone small. But it's your heart. That's too small." A single tear rolled down his cheek. Jessica felt her knees shake. He wasn't just a man. He was the soul of every elderly person ever ignored, ever disrespected, ever broken by pride. Jessica slowly stepped forward. "Sir, I didn't know. I thought—" Morgan stopped her with a raised hand. "You thought I was nothing," he said gently. "Because I didn't shout. Because I was quiet." Jessica looked around. No one was on her side now. The passengers, some her age, many older, watched her in silence. "I've served on flights for 5 years," she said, trying to defend herself. Morgan nodded slowly. "Then 5 years taught you nothing." The head of security entered the cabin. He was calm, dressed in a dark suit. He leaned toward Jessica. "Mrs. Freeman would like to speak with you, now." Jessica's legs went weak. She whispered, "Over the phone?" "No," he replied. "She's on the flight, first row." Jessica's heart dropped. She turned her head and saw the woman, Margaret Freeman, elegant, silent, watching. Jessica had just slapped her husband. Morgan whispered again. "When people grow old, we don't lose value. We gain stories. We gain grace. We gain pain." Jessica began to cry. But her tears? They were too late, because Margaret had already stood up. The cabin went silent again as Margaret Freeman slowly walked toward them. She wore a navy blue coat. Her silver hair was tucked under a hat. Her eyes, calm but sharp like ice. Jessica wiped her face quickly. "Ma'am, Margaret raised a finger. "No, listen." She looked at her husband, touched his cheek gently, and kissed his forehead. Then she turned to Jessica. "You slapped a man," she said. "But you hit more than his skin." Jessica's lips trembled. "You hit every grandparent who raised their voice and were ignored. You hit every quiet soul who asked for help and was mocked. You hit the heart of wisdom, and you did it proudly." Jessica couldn't speak. Then Margaret said something that made the whole cabin tear up. "My husband is not just a man. He's a storyteller. When he speaks, people listen. And today, the world will hear this story." Jessica sank to her knees. "I'm sorry," she cried. Margaret didn't answer. She held Morgan's hand and whispered, "Let's go home." The plane kept flying, but everyone inside felt like they were falling. No one moved. Margaret Freeman helped her husband back into his seat and sat beside him. Her hands gently held his. Jessica, still kneeling, looked around, hoping someone would speak up for her, but no one did. The silence in the cabin wasn't empty. It was heavy, like 1,000 words left unspoken. One older man across the aisle whispered to his wife, "That's Morgan Freeman. He's 86. He just wanted a blanket." Another woman shook her head. "She hit Morgan Freeman." The words were like thunder. Margaret turned and faced the passengers. "My husband has spent decades using his voice to bring peace, to inspire, to comfort." She paused. Today, his silence did more than words ever could. Jessica's eyes filled again. "Please, I didn't know." Morgan, still calm, looked at her and asked one question. "Would you have treated me the same if I were 30? Jessica couldn't answer, because the truth was written all over her face. The problem wasn't who he was. The problem was how she saw the elderly. Morgan Freeman had played presidents, teachers, prisoners, even God. But in real life, he didn't act. He observed. Now, all eyes were on him again. He sat up slowly and spoke in that same soft voice the world knew. "I've been famous a long time," he said. "But that didn't protect me from your hand, because you didn't see me at all. You only saw your own impatience, Jessica wiped her face. I thought you were just being difficult, she said. I was tired and... He stopped her with kindness. You were tired, but so was I. You were stressed, but so was I. He leaned forward. And if we only give grace when it's easy, then it's not grace at all. A young boy sitting 2 rows down suddenly stood up. He held something in his small hand. It was a packet of tissues. He walked up and handed it to Morgan. The entire cabin clapped quietly. Morgan looked at the boy and said, "Thank you, son. You just did what a grown woman could not." Jessica's head dropped. She wasn't being punished by power. She was being broken by truth. Margaret stood again. Her voice was soft but strong, like a mother's warning, like history speaking. There are cameras on this flight, she said. The world will see what happened here. Jessica gasped. Margaret continued, but I won't release the footage unless he wants me to. She looked at her husband. Morgan shook his head. No. Let her carry the memory, not the shame. Jessica looked up, shocked. You're not firing me? Margaret replied, You were already fired. The moment you forgot that kindness is part of your job. Jessica broke down. Morgan stood slowly. His body was weak, but his spirit was strong. He looked at the passengers. To all of you, he said, thank you for watching quietly, for not rushing to anger. Sometimes silence is the greatest defense. He turned back to Jessica. You didn't just strike me. You struck every quiet elder who carries pain in silence. Jessica couldn't hold it anymore. She sobbed into her hands, and Margaret, with tears of her own, whispered, Now, maybe, you'll finally learn to see. Morgan sat back in his seat. His hands trembled just a little, not from weakness, but from the storm inside. Margaret touched his arm and whispered, Are you okay? He nodded, then reached into his coat pocket. What he pulled out wasn't a phone. It was a folded letter, old, worn, written by hand. He looked down at it for a moment, then said aloud, I wrote this to my father. 50 years ago. I never mailed it. Jessica blinked. The others listened closely. Morgan's voice broke a little. I wrote to tell him I forgave him. For walking away. He held the paper, but didn't open it. Sometimes the deepest pain is the one we carry in silence, just like today. Jessica covered her mouth. Morgan placed the letter on the seat beside him. I've learned something after all these years. Even unspoken words have weight. Margaret leaned close and whispered, You've carried others for so long. Let this one go. Tears slid down his face, not because of Jessica, but because that slap had opened an old wound he'd buried long ago. Across the aisle sat a woman in her 70s. She hadn't spoken the entire flight, but now she stood. She looked at Jessica, then at Morgan and said, My husband was ignored in a hospital waiting room. They thought he was just a tired old man. He died an hour later, alone. The cabin fell silent again. She looked directly at Jessica. Do you know what I would give to go back and give him kindness? Even a smile? Jessica wept into her hands. The woman walked over to Morgan and touched his shoulder. Thank you, she said, for not yelling, for reminding us what quiet strength looks like. Morgan smiled softly. He looked at the empty seat next to her and asked gently, Was that his? She nodded. He always sat by the window. Morgan bowed his head. That one moment, just 2 people speaking heart to heart, touched the entire plane. The passengers weren't just watching a scene. They were feeling their own lives, their own memories, their own regrets. Jessica had started this with a slap, but now, hearts were breaking open from something much deeper. Morgan Freeman's voice was known across the globe. He had narrated history, nature, war, peace, even the voice of God. But now, inside this quiet cabin, It wasn't a performance. It was just a man. An old man. A tired man. A man who had been slapped for no reason, just for asking for a blanket. And when he finally spoke again, everyone listened as if heaven had leaned in. "Respect is not about power," he said. "It's about recognizing someone's worth before they prove it." He paused. "And age is not weakness. It's a crown earned by time." Jessica, still crying, whispered, "Why didn't you fight me back?" Morgan turned toward her and said, "Because I was raised by a mother who taught me, never meet hate with hate, only with grace." Margaret squeezed his hand. The cabin crew looked ashamed. Not just Jessica, all of them. The passengers looked changed, and up in the cockpit, the pilot removed his hat, tears in his eyes. This wasn't a flight anymore. Morgan Freeman slowly removed his reading glasses. The cabin lights seemed to dim, even though nothing had changed. He folded the glasses and placed them gently on the tray table. Then, in the softest voice, he said, "When I was a boy, people like me had to sit at the back of the bus." Everyone leaned closer. "I was called names, spat on, laughed at, but never was I hit by someone who was supposed to serve others with kindness." Jessica tried to look away, but something in her heart wouldn't let her. Morgan's voice continued, deeper now. "My mother worked as a cleaner in a hospital. She used to tell me, 'Never speak louder than your piece.'" He looked directly at Jessica. "I did that today. I stayed calm, and that hurt you more than if I had shouted." A young man 2 rows behind whispered to his wife, "I'll never forget this flight for the rest of my life." The cabin was no longer a plane. It was a mirror, and everyone on board was seeing themselves. Jessica finally stood, slowly, gently. She walked down the aisle, not with pride, but with pain. She reached the front of the cabin and turned to Morgan. Her voice shook. "I didn't know who you were, but that's not the point, is it?" He looked at her. "No, it isn't," Jessica continued. "I've been so busy trying to prove myself, I forgot what I became." Tears streamed down her cheeks. Margaret stood beside her husband. "You didn't forget, dear," she said. "You just never learned." Jessica broke down again. "I thought power was being strong, being fast, being right." Morgan answered softly, "No. True power is in the seat beside the sky. It's choosing love when you're given the chance to hate." Jessica wiped her eyes and looked around. Every passenger was crying. The little boy who had given Morgan tissues now stood beside his mother, holding her hand. The woman whose husband had passed away nodded through tears. Jessica turned back to Morgan. "Please forgive me. I didn't see you." Morgan replied gently, "Then open your eyes now, because I'm still here." Suddenly, a soft ding echoed through the cabin. Margaret's phone lit up. She looked at it, paused, then smiled. "It's our lawyer," she said. "He wants to know if we'll press charges." Jessica gasped. Her hands went cold. Morgan looked down for a moment, thoughtful. Then he stood, slowly, carefully. He walked toward Jessica, and what he did next made everyone cry. He held out his hand, not to hurt, but to forgive. "I don't want your job. I don't want revenge. I just want you to change." Jessica took his hand and fell to her knees. "I will," she said. "I promise." Morgan looked to the passengers. "Let today be more than a moment. Let it be a memory that moves you." Everyone clapped, slowly at first, then louder, with tears in their eyes. The pilot's voice came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've all been given a gift today, from Mr. Freeman and from Grace." And as the jet continued to fly through calm skies, the hearts on board flew higher than ever before. Jessica was still kneeling. She held Morgan Freeman's hand as if it were her only anchor. Everyone in the cabin was silent. Even the engines seemed to hum more gently. Margaret leaned toward Morgan and whispered something into his ear. He nodded. Then, she looked at Jessica. I wasn't just passing through today, Margaret said. This flight was a test. Jessica blinked. A test? Margaret continued. We've been reviewing staff anonymously to see how they treat people who seem less important. Jessica's mouth dropped open. Morgan added, You didn't just fail. Margaret finished his sentence. You failed in front of the one person who had the power to lift you. Jessica fell into sobs. I didn't know. Please, don't ruin me. Margaret looked at her one last time. We won't ruin you, Jessica, but life will humble you if you don't learn from this. Then, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something unexpected, a promotion letter. Jessica stared at it, confused. I don't deserve this. Margaret said, You don't. But maybe, if you carry this moment in your heart forever, you'll finally grow into someone who does. Jessica held the letter in her trembling hands. I don't understand, she whispered. Why would you reward me after what I did? Morgan Freeman looked at her, his eyes full of calm. Because the world is full of people waiting for someone to be better, but what it needs is someone willing to help others become better. Margaret added, If we fired you, you'd go home in shame, but if we give you a second chance, you'll go home in change. Jessica dropped to her knees again, not from guilt this time, but from gratitude. The passengers clapped softly, not out of joy, but out of respect. An elderly woman leaned forward and said, This is how healing begins. Morgan turned back to his seat. He opened the window shade and stared out into the sky. A golden sunset painted the clouds. He whispered, not to anyone, but maybe to himself. There's still hope for this world. The little boy who had given him tissues earlier came over again and said, Mr. Freeman, you sound like the movies. Morgan smiled. No, son. In movies, someone else writes the ending, but today, we all wrote it together. As the jet began its slow descent, the passengers remained quiet, but their hearts were loud. Something had happened on that plane, something no camera could fully capture. Not fame, not scandal, but truth and grace. And the moment a man who had been slapped chose mercy instead of revenge. Jessica remained near the front, her eyes still wet. Margaret leaned close and said softly, Remember this flight every time someone annoys you, because the person who seems small might be carrying the world inside them. Morgan stood one final time. He faced the cabin and spoke just once more. I'm not your hero today. I'm just your reminder that the elderly are not invisible. We are history. We are wisdom. And yes, we still feel. Then he turned to Jessica. You're not the villain either. You're the lesson. As the plane touched the runway, everyone knew. This was a flight no one would forget. Not because a man was slapped, but because he answered the slap with forgiveness and taught the sky how to love. Did this story touch your heart? Tell us in the comments, have you ever seen someone treat the elderly unfairly? If Morgan's words moved you, like this video, subscribe for more powerful, real-life inspired stories, and please share this with someone who needs to remember the power of kindness.